Picture this. On a crisp autumn day in downtown Austin, the usual bustle of city life is pierced by haunting melodies. A weathered guitar, its wood telling stories of countless battles fought, rests in the calloused hands of James Miller, a 52-year-old Marine Corps veteran. His voice, rough yet sincere, carries tales of sacrifice across the square. But today isn't about gathering loose change. It's about survival. That's when Joe Rogan, mid-conversation on his phone, stops dead in his tracks. The raw emotion in Miller's voice cuts through everything else. What happens next would change both their lives forever. You see, Miller wasn't just another street performer. 3 tours in Afghanistan, Purple Heart recipient. Now, like thousands of other veterans, fighting a different kind of battle back home. Rogan approaches slowly, mesmerized by Miller's rendition of Hallelujah. The veteran's fingers, once trained for combat, now dance across worn strings with grace that only comes from pain transformed into art. Keep playing, Rogan whispers, dropping $100 bill into the guitar case. But money isn't what this story is about. As Miller's song builds to its crescendo, Rogan pulls out his phone. One call. That's all it took. Jamie, clear tomorrow's schedule. I just found our next guest. The crowd gathering around them falls silent. Tears stream down faces as Miller's voice breaks during the final verse. Some of them veterans themselves, recognizing the weight behind every note. Tomorrow, millions would hear his story. Today, in this moment, a simple act of recognition would remind us all. Sometimes the most powerful connections happen when we just stop and listen. This isn't just about Joe Rogan or James Miller. It's about every veteran whose story deserves to be heard. Every soul who's ever felt invisible in a crowd. Sometimes all it takes is one person to stop and listen, to change everything. The story of James Miller began long before that fateful day in downtown Austin. Growing up in a small town in Montana, he was the kind of kid who'd give his lunch money to classmates who couldn't afford to eat. The kind of teenager who'd shovel his elderly neighbors' driveways without being asked. Service wasn't just something he chose. It was woven into the fabric of his being. His mother, Sarah, a nurse at the local hospital, had taught him early on that music was a form of healing. Every Sunday, she'd play the piano at their local church, and young James would watch in awe as the congregation transformed, their worries melting away with each hymn. It was there, in that small wooden church, that he first understood the power of melody to touch souls. The guitar came into his life on his 13th birthday, a gift from his grandfather, a World War II veteran who'd carried the same instrument through Europe. This guitar, his grandfather told him, has seen both the worst and best of humanity. It's heard prayers in foxholes and celebrations in liberated towns. Now it's your turn to make it sing. September 11, 2001, found him working as a high school music teacher, sharing his passion for melody with young minds. The next day, he walked into a Marine Corps recruiting office. Some people run from the fire, he'd later tell Rogan during their podcast interview. Others run toward it. I couldn't teach kids about courage if I wasn't willing to show it myself. His guitar, that 1967 Martin D28 passed down from his grandfather, went with him to Afghanistan. During his 3 tours, that instrument became more than wood and strings. It became a lifeline. In between missions, he'd play for his fellow Marines, for local children, for anyone who needed a moment of peace in a world torn apart by war. There was one night during his 2nd tour that would stay with him forever. Their unit had lost 2 men in an ambush earlier that day. The bass was heavy with grief and anger. Miller pulled out his guitar and started playing Amazing Grace. One by one, Marines emerged from their tents, drawn by the melody. By the time he finished, 30 battle-hardened soldiers were singing together, their voices carrying across the Afghan night. Music, he realized, could heal wounds no medic could touch. The Purple Heart came during his final tour. A routine patrol turned deadly when their convoy hit an IED. Miller lost 3 brothers that day, and part of himself too. The physical wounds healed, but the invisible ones, they were just beginning their work. The explosion had damaged his left ear, leaving him with permanent tinnitus. The constant ringing should have ended his music, but instead, It became part of his symphony, a reminder of the cost of freedom. Coming home should have been the easy part. But like so many veterans, Miller found himself fighting a different kind of war. The VA benefits barely covered his basic needs. The nightmares kept him from holding down a steady job. The medication they prescribed made his fingers too numb to play properly. The world had moved on during his service, leaving him feeling like a stranger in his own country. His marriage, already strained by multiple deployments, couldn't survive the aftermath. Sarah, his wife of 15 years, tried to understand the man who'd returned, so different from the one who'd left. But the silences grew longer, the distance wider, until one day she left a note saying she couldn't watch him disappear into himself anymore. So he made a choice: music over medication. He'd rather feel the pain and keep his art than numb both. That's how he ended up in that square, playing not just for money, but for sanity, for connection, for survival. Each song became a form of therapy, each lyric a way to process the trauma he carried. What the crowd gathering that day didn't know was that Miller had been playing in that same spot for 3 months straight. Every day, from sunrise to sunset, pouring his soul into each song. Some days he'd make enough for a meal, others, barely enough for bus fare. But he kept coming back because music was the only thing that still made sense. He'd become a familiar sight to the regular passers-by. The barista from the corner coffee shop would bring him hot coffee on cold mornings. A local teacher would stop to request songs for her music class. Even the beat cops knew him. One of them, a fellow veteran, would often sit during his break, just listening. The morning of that fateful encounter, Miller had woken up in his car, his home for the past 2 months. His savings had run dry, and pride kept him from asking for help. He'd spent his last $5 on new strings for his guitar, choosing music over breakfast. The decision wasn't just about priorities. It was about identity. Without his music, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. That morning had started differently. A young girl, maybe 7 years old, had stopped to watch him play. Her mother tried to pull her away, but she stood transfixed. "Your guitar," she said. "It sounds like it's crying and laughing at the same time." Her innocent observation had struck something deep in Miller's soul. That's when he'd started playing Hallelujah. When Joe Rogan walked by, Miller was playing the song for the third time that day. But this version was different. Later, Rogan would describe it as the kind of music that doesn't just enter your ears. It grabs your soul and demands you pay attention. The podcast host, known for his intense curiosity and genuine connections, recognized something in Miller's performance that went beyond mere talent. It was raw truth. Pain transformed into beauty, resilience set to melody. As Rogan approached, the veteran's fingers never missed a note, but his eyes told a story of recognition. Here was a man whose platform had given voice to countless stories, standing before someone whose story needed to be heard. The $100 bill was just the beginning. What happened next would ripple through the veteran community and beyond. That evening, as the sun set over Austin, Miller found himself in an Uber headed to a hotel. Rogan had insisted, made all the arrangements. "Get some rest," he'd said. "Tomorrow, we're going to have a conversation that needs to be heard." For the first time in months, Miller slept in a real bed, his guitar safely beside him, like a faithful companion on this unexpected journey. The next day's podcast recording became legendary in the JRE community. Miller brought his guitar, of course. Between deeply personal stories of war, loss, and the struggles of returning home, he played. Each song became a chapter in his story, each note a testament to survival. He shared the story of that night in Afghanistan, playing Amazing Grace for his grieving brothers. He talked about the moment the IED exploded, and how the last thing he heard before the ringing in his ears was his friend's laugh. But it wasn't just Miller's story being told. Through his experiences, millions of listeners would hear echoes of their own veterans. Fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, people who'd given everything for their country, only to find themselves fighting new battles on home soil. The interview went places most military conversations wouldn't dare: the guilt of survival, the addiction to adrenaline, the struggle to find meaning in civilian life. During one particularly powerful moment, Miller shared the story of his first firefight. "People think it's like the movies," he said, his fingers absently strumming his guitar. "But it's not the shooting that stays with you. It's the silence after. The way time seems to stop. The way your buddy's hand feels when you're checking for a pulse that isn't there anymore." He then played a song he'd written in that silence, and the studio fell completely still. The podcast went viral within hours of release. Hashtag James Miller and hashtag VeteranStrong started trending. But more importantly, something began to shift in the way people saw the veterans in their own communities. The comments section filled with stories of listeners reaching out to the veterans in their lives, often for the first time understanding the depth of their experiences. Local news stations picked up the story. Veterans organizations reached out. A GoFundMe page set up by a listener hit 6 figures within days. But the most powerful impact came from the smallest gestures. People stopping to listen to street performers, asking veterans about their stories, showing up with open hearts and minds. Miller used most of the donated money to establish a music therapy program for veterans, turning his personal medicine into a healing tool for others. The program, which he named Notes of Honor, would go on to help hundreds of veterans find their voice through music. He partnered with local music stores to provide instruments, with professional musicians offering free lessons, and with VA hospitals to integrate music therapy into their treatment programs. One of his first students was a young Marine, fresh from Iraq, who hadn't spoken a word since returning home. For weeks, he would just sit and listen as Miller played. Then one day, he picked up a drum and started playing along. By the end of the month, he was teaching rhythm classes to other veterans. Music, Miller would later say, speaks when words fail, and sometimes that's exactly what healing needs. Rogan didn't just move on to the next story. He became a regular advocate for veteran support, using his platform to highlight the gaps in the system and the importance of community support. The $100 bill he dropped in Miller's guitar case that day became a symbol of something larger: the power of stopping, listening, and taking action. The impact rippled further than anyone could have anticipated. A senator who'd heard the podcast pushed for legislation to expand music therapy coverage in VA benefits. Music schools across the country started offering scholarships specifically for veterans. Miller's story had become a catalyst for change, proving that sometimes the most powerful revolutions start with a single song. 1 year later, Miller returned to that same square in downtown Austin. But this time he wasn't alone. Dozens of veterans joined him, each with their own instrument, their own story. Among them was the young girl who'd stopped to listen that fateful morning, now taking violin lessons and playing alongside her father, a Gulf War veteran who'd been inspired to pick up music again after hearing Miller's story. Together, they played Hallelujah, the song that had started it all. The sound was different now, richer with the harmony of multiple instruments and voices, each adding their own layer to the melody. The crowd that gathered that day wasn't just watching a performance. They were witnessing a transformation, of one man's pain into purpose, of strangers into family, of silence into symphony. As the last notes faded into the autumn air, Miller looked out at the faces before him, some tearful, some smiling, all connected by this moment. He saw Joe Rogan in the back of the crowd, nodding silently, remembering that first encounter that had changed everything. Beside him stood Miller's ex-wife Sarah, who'd reached out after hearing the podcast. While their marriage couldn't be saved, they'd found a new kind of friendship, bonded by their shared commitment to helping others heal through music. This is more than a story about a podcast host and a veteran. It's a reminder that every person we pass on the street carries a universe within them. It's about the courage it takes to share your truth, and the power we all have to change a life by simply choosing to listen. It's about how music can bridge the gaps between us, killing wounds we didn't even know we had. What started in that square has grown into something far beyond what either Miller or Rogan could have imagined. Today, Notes of Honor operates in 37 cities across America. Each location has its own unique character, but they all share the same foundation: veterans helping veterans through the universal language of music. In Seattle, a former Navy SEAL leads drumming circles that help combat veterans process their PTSD. The rhythmic beating becomes a way to express what words cannot. Each strike of the drum, a release of pent-up emotion. It's like speaking in code, one participant explained. But instead of secrets, we're sharing our souls. In Miami, a retired Air Force pilot transformed her garage into a recording studio where veterans can create their own music. The walls are lined with photos of successful graduates, men and women who found their voice through song. One of them, a former Army medic, recently topped the local indie charts with an album about his experiences in Iraq. The program has even reached overseas. American bases in Germany and Japan now host Notes of Honor sessions, creating a global network of healing through harmony. Military families have reported stronger connections, better communication, and deeper understanding through their participation in the program. But perhaps the most profound impact can be seen in the small moments, like when a veteran who hasn't left his house in months finds the courage to attend a group session, or when a military spouse finally understands their partner's struggle through a song they've written. These are the victories that don't make headlines but change lives nonetheless. Miller's guitar, that faithful 1967 Martin D28, has become something of a legend in veteran circles. Veterans travel from across the country to play it, each adding their own story to its rich history. Some say you can feel the weight of all those stories in its wood. Hear the echoes of countless battles in its strings. Last Memorial Day, something extraordinary happened. In that same Austin Square where it all began, over 500 veterans gathered with their instruments. They played a medley of songs that told their collective story, from Amazing Grace to Hallelujah, from military hymns to original compositions. The sound was overwhelming, a testament to the healing power of music and community. Joe Rogan was there, of course. He stood in the crowd, recording the event on his phone like everyone else. But this time, he wasn't just an observer. He joined Miller on stage, not to speak but to listen, as the veteran played a new song he'd written about that first encounter. Sometimes angels wear baseball caps, Miller joked, nodding to Rogan's signature look. And sometimes salvation comes with a podcast. The VA has taken notice. A pilot program based on Notes of Honor is being implemented in VA hospitals across the country. Early results show significant improvements in PTSD symptoms, depression rates, and social reintegration among participating veterans. What started as one man's way of surviving has become a recognized form of therapy. Miller's ex-wife Sarah now runs the administrative side of Notes of Honor. Their reconciliation as friends and partners in this mission has become another layer of the healing story. Sometimes, she says, you have to lose something to find something greater. Together, they've created a support network that extends beyond the veterans to include their families, creating a comprehensive approach to healing. The young girl who'd stopped to listen that first day, her name is Emma, and she's now a regular fixture at Notes of Honor events. Her violin plays counterpoint to Miller's guitar. Their duet's a symbol of how music bridges generations and experiences. Her father, inspired by the program, has become one of its most dedicated volunteers. Miller still keeps that $100 bill Rogan gave him, framed in his office at the Notes of Honor headquarters. Next to it hangs his Purple Heart, his grandfather's dog tags, and dozens of photos of veterans whose lives have been touched by the program. But his most prized possession remains that weathered guitar. Its wood now bearing the fingerprints of hundreds of veterans who found healing in its strings. The square in Austin has been officially renamed Harmony Square, a testament to the movement that began there. A small plaque tells Miller's story, but the real monument is the music that fills the air every day. Veterans still gather there, sharing their stories through song, finding understanding in melody, and sealing in harmony. This story reminds us that sometimes the most profound changes start with the simplest actions: stopping to listen, choosing to care, daring to share. In a world that often feels disconnected and divided, it shows us that music can build bridges where walls once stood. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you hear music drifting through a city square, you'll remember James Miller and his guitar. You'll think of all the stories waiting to be heard, all the healing waiting to happen, because every song carries a story, and every story has the power to change a life. After all, isn't that what this journey has taught us? That in our most broken moments, we might find our greatest purpose. That our deepest wounds, when transformed through art and shared with courage, can become the medicine others need. That sometimes, all it takes to start a revolution of kindness is one person willing to stop and listen. So let the music play on. Let the stories continue to be told. And let us all remember that in the end, we're all just walking each other home, one song at a time.